Well, glad to be here. I've come in contact with a lot of you in different roles in Samaritan's work throughout the state and in New York City with the Department of Education and the Office of Mental Health, Department of Mental Health, all the acronyms. You can fill in the blanks, but so we're really pleased to have the opportunity to spend a little time with you folks and to share Samaritan's approach to responding to people who are in distress, depressed, and suicidal. Um, Samaritans, for those of you that are not familiar, is the world's oldest and largest suicide prevention network. It created the world's first suicide hotline in 1952. There's over 400 affiliated centers in 42 countries around the world. Our approach has been adapted and modified to fit in a cross section of the world's cultures, communities, and areas that are dealing with all manner of crises, trauma, mental health issues, etc. Samaritans is on what we call the humanistic side of helping. And I was just commenting, I'm joined by my colleague, Sambol Augustine, uh, and we were just talking before we got started. I'm not trained as a clinician. I'm a communications person. That was my background in history. And I was just going back and reading something about cognitive dissonance, and I happened to come across some of Carl Rogers' early writings. And there, people always say, "What do you mean by humanistic? What do you mean by humanistic approach?" It was like there it was in black and white, where the respondent, the caregiver, the health providers' focus should be more on recognizing the point of view, the perspective of the person that we're responding to, than our own judgments, approaches, beliefs, and attitudes. And that's at the heart of Samaritan's work. Excuse me. We say that our work is global, is international. And one day I was doing one of these presentations, and a volunteer of ours who actually is a pretty renowned author on UFOs said, "Alan, it's not international, it's intergalactic, because the signals that we're sending out into space are, how are you doing? What's going on? Would you like to talk?" So we feel that Samaritans is already moving through the universe, and it's a wonderful organization. It's mostly volunteer driven. There are over 25,000 Samaritans volunteers working in hotlines and crisis centers in 42 countries, literally from A to Z, from Australia and Argentina to Zimbabwe. And in each country, our approach is adapted to that culture. A lot of the work we do is tied to hotlines and crisis centers. In some countries, Zimbabwe is a good example, where in rural areas, people don't necessarily have that much access to telephone. And I love this story. I always tell this story because the person who told it to me had pictures. And in Zimbabwe, in certain areas, on Thursday afternoon, under the acacia tree, in front of the library, the Samaritans volunteer is there if you want to come and talk about something. In Sri Lanka, a lot of the work is done working through the hospitals and going from the hospital and the person who's experiencing problems, working back into the family from there. We were early in work in the corrections, in the prison systems all over the world. So our approach is pretty much a common sense approach. It, it draws on good clinical practice. It draws on humanitarian behaviors, on spiritual practice. It's founded and grounded in communications theory. Uh, and basically, it's what makes it, I think, kind of unique. It was created by an Episcopalian minister who was also a psychotherapist, who established a non-religious, non-clinical, humanitarian volunteer organization, believing that what was needed to engage people who were struggling with their emotional and mental health was a safe point of access where people felt comfortable approaching and talking about their difficulties and their problems. In New York City, Samaritans runs the only completely confidential crisis service. You're in the field, you know about confidentiality, and almost without exception, confidential services use caller ID, and a lot of the people answering the phones are mandated reporters, so they're confidential until they feel they can no longer be. And no one's criticizing that, but that's very different than Samaritans, which is more like a mental health confession kind of environment where it is absolutely and completely confidential and no action is taken without a caller's permission. So we want to share what we've learned, and we're not telling people what they should do or how to approach things, but we will say we've been doing this for 70 years. We've responded to something like 2 billion people throughout the world over that time, and we've learned a few things. So we're sharing what we've learned. Take from it what you will. So I'll kind of present it declaratively because that's our approach, but the understanding is everyone develops their own practice and their own approach from their own experience, education, and knowledge. And this is just meant to supplement and complement what you do and how you do it. As you know, whether it's you have a bad day or a broken heart or an unexpected loss, a physical or mental illness, you're dealing with substance abuse, trauma, some dramatic loss, or you're actually experiencing self-harming and suicidal behavior, everybody at some point in their life has trouble coping with the circumstances that they're dealing with. And there's a lot of literature out there right now about the pressures that caregivers and health providers and teachers are experiencing during the pandemic, where this profession is so busy taking care of other people that the stresses and difficulties they have, plus their professional one, is increasing risk and the distress that the mental health professional and caregiver community is experiencing. So our attitude is this is not just about how do we help other people, it's also how do we help ourselves and how do we look at the issues that we're dealing with. It's, I think, not ironic that suicide proves the universality of men and women. No matter what your age, your race, your culture, your sexual identity, your socioeconomic standing, your religion, your political affiliation, nothing prevents you from being in distress, depressed, overwhelmed, and when it gets to the extreme, experiencing suicide ideation. So as we look at this, we look at the cross section again from the most basic difficulties, which, perception's everything. If I break my nose and I feel my life's coming to an end because I'm taking my graduation pictures tomorrow, or in fact, if I've lost a leg, for each person, pain and distress is relative. And the fact that with the concept that perception is everything, it doesn't matter if it's, quote, true or not. If you think nobody loves you, it doesn't matter if you're surrounded by a loving family. If you feel that you're a failure or you suffer from a lifetime of low self-esteem, it doesn't matter what you accomplish. So we very much pay attention to the fact of recognizing the limits of our awareness, our perception, and that kind of grounds us in our approach. And we're also right now, Samaritans, we're constantly doing hotline training. Every member of the organization was originally a Samaritans hotline volunteer. I joined Samaritans as a volunteer in 1984. I was corporate communications consultant. I was a university faculty member, and I was a freelance writer. And I came to Samaritans thinking I was an exceptional communicator. I was paid a lot of money to communicate and to design communications programs, and I barely made it through the training program. So the training program is very direct. It's very challenging about our assumptions, our preconceptions, what we think and how we think it. And one of the ways our training program starts is very direct to the participants, and it says, what does it say if you get to the point in life where you feel you have nothing left to learn? And this is something that we've done as we're joined with Cheryl Hall from New York City DOE. She says she's retiring, but I'm not really sure. But this is something when we train guidance counselors and social workers and psychologists in DOE, we challenge them about being willing to look at, to re-examine their perceptions, their approach, their beliefs. I spent 20 years paying off my graduate school education, so I try to use it on occasion. And one of the lines, one of my favorite from Hamlet, is there's more to life than can be dreamt of in your philosophy. To which the kids on the street would say, hey, bud, get over yourself. So this is kind of at the heart of how we approach the work we do. What I'd like to do in the short time we're together is to address some of the challenges, some of the difficulties we have in responding to people who are in distress, to re-examine some of our approaches and perceptions, and some of it will probably be a refresher or a review of warning signs, risk and protective factors, of active listening and assessing risk. In all Samaritans training, we point to the fact that it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how educated you are, it doesn't matter how much experience you have. If people don't feel comfortable talking to you, if you can't establish trust, it doesn't matter. And that's many times a very difficult thing to accept. One of the lines we use is that the intellect is vastly overrated when it comes to responding to people in distress. It's not what you think. It's not even what you do. It's how you do it. So we're very behaviorally driven, and that's at the heart of some of the approach that we take. And as I move into the material, the point is this could be for the most a basic difficulty, a bad day, a broken heart, some reversal in life, to severe, serious mental illness, psychological and traumatic issues, substance abuse. The approach is the same no matter what the state of the person you're responding to. And you may know these things, but I'm going to kind of do it to set us up. And the first point of departure would be that suicide prevention is not about suicide. Suicide is not a health problem. People are suicidal for every illness, reversal, difficulty, challenge, trauma they've experienced. And any problem, from the most simple to the most dramatic, without support, without coping mechanisms, without resources, can lead to self-harming and suicidal behavior. And we know this, and a lot of this is, we've lost a little bit of the drama of the significant public health problem that is depression, psychological disorders, and suicide, because we're all overwhelmed with the numbers tied to COVID. So first I want to kind of set up some of the stats that existed until a year ago, and then we'll kind of bring it into perspective for today. And again, this is just a cross-section and overview. This is not in-depth research and review of statistical studies. Suicide before COVID was the 10th leading cause of death in the country. Suicide has been increasing in the country and in New York City and state for the last 10 years. As I said before, it touches every age group, every race, every culture. One of the points I always like to make in the social political world we live in is most people think that people who are suicidal, who have trouble getting help, come from populations that are impoverished or have limited access to healthcare. And certainly those populations have very, very serious problems and access is an issue. But what I find fascinating, and when I first came to Samaritans, I was a journalist, so I researched the topic as a journalist, and I discovered that, who makes the most money in America? Older white males, unless you work in the nonprofit field, but older white males. Who makes the most money? Who has the most education? Right? Who has, unfortunately, in recent times, the most political power? And the key point, who has the most access to healthcare? Older white males. Who commits the most suicide in America? Older white males. So the idea that untreated depression, that mental health problems are just tied to socioeconomics is a false one. Anyone at any time, under any circumstance, in fact, privilege, as much as we may not like the way people of privilege behave, if someone on this webinar is privileged, I apologize and please send a donation to Samaritans. But as much as privilege can appear to be a benefit to people, it's actually an isolating factor. And isolation is one of the leading risk factors for self-harming and suicidal behavior. So we see it across the board. Men have traditionally driven suicide statistics, but in the last 5 years, women's self-harming and suicidal behavior has increased at 2 to 3 times the rate of men. And the very scary aspect of that is the means that are being used for self-harming behavior are getting more and more lethal. So not only is it increasing, but the methods of approaching the self-harming behavior are becoming more fatal. So that's what's been happening on that level. The elderly make up approximately 13 to 14% of the population, but they commit 18% of the suicide. And there's all kinds of issues tied to that. One of which is the stigma that getting older means you're naturally depressed and have trouble coping, which of course those of us that are getting older know is not necessarily true. And again, is a stigma tied to aging.
These on my computer.
Then if you were to go to the other end of the spectrum, when you talk about youth, which is of importance to a lot of people on the webinar, suicide is the second leading cause of death of adolescents in this country. Same for New York. It's violence, it's accidents, suicide, homicide. And my guess is most of you have a background or education in social work or psychology, and remind yourself that violence expressed outwardly is homicide. Violence expressed inwardly is suicide, and there's a very thin line between the two. So violence is a very significant issue, especially amongst youth in risk. The YRBS, which is the CDC, puts out something called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, YRBS. It's done every 2 years to research the state of physical and mental health in older adolescents throughout the country. It's done in major cities throughout the country. In New York City, the most recent YRBS showed that approximately 18% of New York City public high school students consider suicide every year. That as many as 8 to 8.5% attempt, And as many as 3 to 3.5% of those, the attempt is so significant it requires medical care and treatment. So this is not a theoretical problem. Obviously, those of you working on the front lines in schools and community organizations, you see this on a regular basis. And it's getting worse. And the YRBS in New York shows, unlike the rest of the country, that the leading risk populations are young female Hispanics, young Latinas, and young female Asian and adolescent members of the LGBTQ community. Certainly African Americans and Caucasians are high risk, but whereas in the rest of the country, most of it would have been driven by the Caucasian race, in New York City, it's most impacting cultures of color. So that just, again, it's a snapshot of what we're looking at. And now when you look at the impact on COVID, what was bad has gotten dramatically worse. There's a 300%, again, our information from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, the federal government's mental health arm, and under SAMHSA is the Surgeon General and the CDC. So all the mental health statistics done by the government tend to fall under NIMH, SAMHSA, or the CDC. And SAMHSA tells us as recently as a month ago that there's been a 300% increase in anxiety across the country, that there's been a 400% increase in depression, and the rates of suicide ideation have doubled. And then when you drill down and you start looking at youth, they are not spared in this scenario, where ER visits and hospitalizations are up 24% since before the pandemic for 5 to 11-year-olds. A 24% increase from 5 to 11-year-olds and a 31% increase for adolescents 12 to 17 compared to the previous year. So we're looking at an entire population that's at risk, from the professional community, all of you really, I mean, not only are you dealing with all the things tied to the pandemic, I shouldn't say you, all of us, dealing with all of the challenges, issues, reversals, fears tied to the pandemic. But then on top of it, we are in the position of trying to help and take care of other people. And it doesn't take a genius to realize when you help people deal with their pain, you take some of it on yourself. So the caring community, the educators, the counselors, the support and mental health caregiving staff, their level of risk is increasing as well. And this is something that we really want to be aware of. And tied to that, and again, every one of these topics we could spend an hour on. Obviously, we don't have that here. But, tied to this is we're seeing increases in substance abuse. We're seeing increases in domestic violence. We're seeing increases in all types of violence, whether it's partner violence or sexual violence, and violence against, we're seeing it obviously in tied to ethnic communities, tied to LGBTQ. So all of these are basically symptoms of the difficulties and challenges we're dealing with. And so where it was 1 in 5 Americans in the course of a year would experience a psychological disorder, now it's closer to 2 in 5, 40% of the population. And the most scary statistic from my perspective is the one that points to the fact that somewhere between 50 and 60% of the people who experience a psychological disorder will never receive care or help of any kind, And we use that as kind of a point of focus to remind ourselves, no matter how smart we think we are, how caring we think we are, how involved we are, if half the population who needs support and help isn't getting it, and we keep behaving the same way we are, we're not going to impact this problem in any fashion. And those of us in suicide prevention have seen a tremendous increase in programs and services and hotlines over the last 10 years, and the rate keeps going up. So it really, again, from a Samaritan's perspective, it's a call to conscience, which is you better step back and look how you're doing things, because no matter how nice, caring, and smart you think you are, half the people aren't coming to you. And it's certainly a hard thing to accept, but it is a fact of life, and it doesn't seem to be changing. And to carry it one step further, some of those that are at highest risk are those who are getting treatment, are being hospitalized, and are in care. So the idea that if you're seeing a mental health professional, you're safe. If you're going to treatment, you're safe. You're on meds, you're safe. That's a false impression that we want to make sure that we correct. Now, the good news is when you look at the epidemiological research tied to suicide, somewhere between 70 and 75% of the people who are involved in self-harming and suicidal behavior tell us. They tell us what they're thinking. They tell us what they're feeling, not in like the movies with a poem or some song in the background. They literally tell us we either don't hear it, we don't know how to respond, we're afraid to get involved. It brings up stuff for us that makes us be too close to it to be able to deal with it. And again, every one of these topics I'm bringing up, there's 10 more points we can make to it. So we're kind of, by definition, staying on the surface. But the point is that it's one of the rare places that prevention should work, because the vast majority of people who are having this problem let us know, and yet we're still not making any inroads that can be observed in reducing and developing a much more comprehensive approach to helping people. So if suicide is so prevalent, I don't know how many of you are on camera or mic, not too many from what I'm seeing here. If suicide is so prevalent, then why does it make us so uncomfortable? We've done, I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of trainings for guidance counselors and social workers, and we ask this question directly. You know, you deal with AIDS, you deal with domestic violence, you deal with child abuse, you deal with incest, you deal with all these painful, difficult, terrible things that people go through. But why is it that suicide scares us so much? And the most common answer people say, especially guidance counselors and social workers, is if a client or a student says to me they feel suicidal, all of a sudden I feel like there's a spotlight on me, there's a microphone in front of me, someone's recording everything I do, and whatever the outcome is, I'm going to be responsible. And it makes you, on the most basic level, defensive. It makes you cautious. It makes you concerned, and people get scared about the appropriate way to respond. Most frequently, you hear people say, I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. I'm afraid I'll make matters worse. And all of these are certainly understandable. But the reality is you don't put suicidal thoughts in someone's head. We have about 80 people on this webinar. If I said to you, how many of you own a gun? None of you is that going to be a catalyst for you to decide to go out and buy a gun and shoot somebody. The scary part that comes with talking to people who are suicidal, which is if we're effective, when they open up to us, there's a lot more going on than we recognized. It's a lot more emotionally charged than they were when they got in. I did a training for guidance counselors in Brooklyn a few years back. It was a 3-hour training. It was more in depth than this one. And a couple of weeks later, one of the guidance counselors called me up and he was cursing me and yelling at me and saying, I don't know what the F you think you're doing. You guys don't know what you're talking about. I had a young woman come into my office and sit down, and she looked good and seemed calm and relaxed. And I started using the active listening and exploring her thoughts and feelings as you suggest, and we'll get into in a little more detail later. And now she was hysterical and upset and crying. You know, what the hell's wrong with you? It was like, would you rather she would, if she was yelling and crying by herself, or that she was felt comfortable enough to let you know what she was going through? But it is upsetting. It is challenging. If we are effective in connecting with people, they're going to open up. And opening up is scary. We do hotline training, and we spend the first 2 weeks of hotline training. Now, these are people who volunteer their time to every 5 days work in person. We're designated as essential workers, and our hotline requires we can't work remotely. We work in person because we work as teams. And so these are people who are donating their time. They're going through 32 hours of intensive training, and intensive training is verbally abusive. It's confrontive, it's adversarial. We're not going to wait until you get on the line to see how you handle people who are traumatized, who are sociopaths, who are very aggressive and violent and threatening. And still, their tendency is to steer away from people's thoughts and feelings, to steer away from the pain, to focus on facts and information instead of thoughts and feelings. So it's a hard thing to overcome. And part of that is tied to the stigma, myths, and misconceptions that are part of tied to mental health and tied to suicide. We all know that mental health stigma, you break your arm, you get cancer, you get AIDS. You're actually, the irony is the suicide prevention movement in America paralleled the beginnings of the advocacy for AIDS advocates. And I don't know how many of you are old enough to know or remember this, but the major symbol or sign for early days of AIDS prevention was silence equals death. And so dealing with those kinds of things, well, if someone has cancer, whatever you say to them, their cancer isn't going to get worse. If someone has AIDS, if someone's been, this terrible aspect of being a victim of sexual violence or of some form of abuse, but it already happened. When it comes to suicide and depression, our fears are so strongly tied to what's going to happen next, what's going to happen now. And so often, the people who are coming to us are already impacted by that stigma. They've been put down, they've been told to snap out of it, they've been told to get over it. Look, other people have it worse than you. You just have to have a positive attitude. I grew up in Texas. I grew up in macho male 50s Texas. And it was pull yourself up by your bootstraps. They literally said that because you had bootstraps in Texas. It was, you keep your feelings to yourself. You're a man. You should be able to handle it. Men don't cry. I mean, these were things I heard my whole life. My father would say to me my whole life, stop being so emotional. It was kind of ironic. He's passed many years ago. We were fairly estranged, but before he passed, I was doing a training, I was just mentioning it before, with the New York City Police Department. And my father, who showed very little interest in either of his children, but as most white males who are not very emotional, as he started to die, he became a little more sensitive. And he said to me, what does that training consist of? What are you doing? And I described the, empathetic listening and the approach of responding to the person, not the problem. And there was silence on the line for a second. And he went, oh, you're teaching people not to be like me. So and it was a light bulb moment for me, but it also I had to end up reflecting, well, his behavior was so egregious, it was easy for him. But how many of us think of ourselves, as above it, as beyond criticism, and therefore justify everything we say and do? So it was a wake up moment, but it points to the idea that as a culture, a Western culture, mental health problems are a sign of weakness. Someone is called crazy. Yeah, I was a journalist originally. When I read what's put in newspapers about people struggling, it's just nauseating and also obviously quite inappropriate. Um, but the whole idea that if you don't fit in, there's something wrong with you. I'm not a scholar or an academic, and I don't want to pretend to be, but I've done a good cross section of basic readings. And Thomas Zaz, the early Thomas Zaz, not the guy who kind of went off the deep end later in his career, um, talked about the fact in America, um, if you're mentally ill, you're treated like a criminal. It's the only place. Now, this is pre-terrorism. This is in the 50s and 60s, but it was the only place where you could be institutionalized without due process. Your husband, your brother, your mother, your teacher, your boss could say you were a danger, could say something, and you could be put on a 72-hour hold without due process. And I don't know how many of you in life have ever had somebody come and arrest you or take charge of you or try to physically maneuver you. But the odds are pretty good. If you feel you're okay and a police officer or a health practitioner comes and tries to restrain you, your reaction might be to take a swing and fight back. And now you're not on a 72-hour hold. You're on a week with now a legal issue. So the whole idea of criminalizing a mental health problem, you wouldn't criminalize a broken arm, you wouldn't criminalize cancer, Parkinson's. And then the other point that I thought was made by Zaz, which I found fascinating, was that if you look at cultures throughout the world, people who suffered from, quote, mental illness, which maybe there was an article today saying we should call it a neurological challenge, was in the mediums, the medicine people, the spiritualists, many times fit the same definition that we have for people that we would be in the diagnostic manual of mental illness. An example someone pointed out to me one day was, for those of you in New York City, that you can go when you could go to Lincoln Center to go to the opera, and there's a big fountain in front of Alice Tully Hall, a beautiful fountain that's quite frequently surrounded by homeless people, people who are both homeless and mentally ill. A lot of them ex veteran or veterans from Vietnam War, who are suffering their co-occurring disorders. They have all kinds of issues they're dealing with. And people will step away and be afraid to get near that person and go see an opera by Verdi or Wagner, who was diagnosed mentally ill. So is it a question of your illness or a question of how it manifests? We know that many high performance people have behavioral disorders. Our former president, probably a good example. Those of you that are Republican, I apologize, but not too much. The point being that depending upon how your behavior manifests, it's either socially acceptable or not. But when it comes to illness, if you are impoverished, if you don't have a profession, if you can't make a living, if you're homeless, then you're looked at as less. And that's part of the problem. We run something called survivor groups for people who lost loved ones to suicide. It's called Survivors of Suicide Loss. And they tell these stories. These are support groups for people that feel they have no one to talk to when it comes to suicide because family and friends blame them. Why didn't you know? Why didn't you do something? You should have been known there was a gun. You should have, and we can't even anticipate our own behavior in lives. We're supposed to anticipate other people's. And they would say, this one woman told this story that, it's 20 years ago, still breaks my heart to think about it. She lost her a young 12 or 13-year-old son to suicide. They lived in a suburban neighborhood. All the kids played together. All the families had picnics together. And all of a sudden, the parents wouldn't let the kids come play in their yard, wouldn't let them come to their house, as if there was some disease, some illness in the walls. You know, kind of, I mean, COVID's a good example. We are afraid of respiratory, of droplets, of something in the air. But there's a reason for that. But this was the attitude tied to suicide. You could catch it. And if that's what you're seeing, if you're suffering, if you're struggling, if you're treated like a lesser person, if you're looked down on, if you're blamed for what you're thinking or feeling, if you're told to snap out of it, and even, and some of you may not like the way this is pointed. The good news is you don't know my address and I won't see you again. But the bottom line is a lot of the people in the caring, education, and healthcare field add to this, not necessarily deliberately, but on the idea, well, what do you think would make you feel better? What do you think you could do? Why are you behaving that way? And when we get to communication, it seems innocent enough. Well, the word why has a very specific meaning. It means, first of all, that it expects that there's an explanation for what happened, that you understand what it is, and that you can express it. That's pretty adversarial. So it may come out as if you're just asking a basic question, but whether the person consciously or unconsciously recognizes it, it's not a support concept. It's a power, control, direct concept. And that's so much about what goes on tied to stigma and the myths and misconceptions. And here you have people, if you're Islamic or you're Jewish or you're Catholic or whatever you might be, whether it's an imam or a rabbi or a minister, in many religious and spiritual environments, suicide is considered a sin or it's frowned upon. So if I'm a good Jewish boy, if I'm a practicing Muslim, if I'm a Catholic choir boy, and I always talk to my priest or my imam or my rabbi about what goes on in my life, and now I'm confused by my sexuality, I did something I shouldn't have, all these things, I've just lost my primary support person. And the message is, keep it to yourself. So we're sending out all these messages. Samaritan's Hotline in New York has entered about 1.3 million calls over the last 30 years. And you would be amazed to hear how many callers say, well, I didn't really want to tell my therapist about this because I didn't want him to think poorly of me. Right? So we create expectations, we create projections, we create judgments, whether we intend them or not, unintended consequences. So one of the things that Samaritans preaches is that stigma and the myths and misconceptions don't just come from the outside world. Inadvertently, a lot of us support it benignly or inadvertently in some of our language, our behavior, and attitude. And I think at the heart of it, now again, this isn't about behavior problems. This isn't about problems that need a very specific form of care and treatment. We're talking about distress, depression, psychological, emotional problems, trauma. These are ongoing problems that don't have solutions. What's the answer if you're bipolar to make it go away? How do you teach someone to overcome a broken heart when their most beloved partner has died? The idea that there are answers to the multiplicity of issues that create distress, depression, many of it, as you know, is genetic, is predetermined. I have a history. I didn't know this. No one talked about it. I'm born in the early 50s. My mother was born in 1920. Her mother was born in 1890. Believe me, No one pointed to the fact that grandma never left the house, had some behavioral problem. So I didn't know there was a family predisposition towards depression and substance abuse. And so if you ask me what's going on, I don't know. Uh, the idea that these behaviors have are caused by a problem, and it's our job to figure out what the problem is. We're playing detective. You know, we're trying. What are the clues? What happened? And then what did you do? We're fact finding. We're information gathering. To what end? Uh, I broached it before. The whole idea, and most of you probably have studied conflict resolution in some way. And the first key points to conflict resolution are establish fairness and separate the person from the problem. People are not problems, they're complex, they're multidimensional, they're unknowing. You can figure out what you can, but most of what goes on in a person, not only won't you know, we don't know ourselves. How many times do we say, why did I do that? I wish I hadn't done that. Why did I say that? How come I keep getting myself in the same situation? Right? We don't necessarily even understand a lot of our own motivations and behaviors. Why would we think we would understand somebody else's? At the beginning of Samaritan's Hotline training, we start by saying, you don't solve other people's problems for them. It's hard enough to handle your own. You don't save another person's life. You help him or her get through a moment, this moment, now. So we recognize what we can and cannot do. We're not going to fix it. We're not going to solve it. We're not going to tie it in a knot. If you were raped and you called and you're having a flashback to your trauma, when you get off the phone, you've still been raped, and the odds are that that trauma is going to exist. If you're bipolar or you have some kind of other behavioral or psychological problem, no matter what I say or do, and I could be the nicest, kindest, most gentle, warm, and caring person in the world, when you get off the phone, when you leave the school, when you go home from your session, you're right back where you started. And that is a very important thing to recognize. It's a line from the 60s, which was kind of a joke then, but I think it's very applicable to what we do, which is wherever you go, there you are. You take your stuff with you. There's no magic answer. There's nothing that you're going to fix or solve. We do an exercise in the hotline training called what didn't you want? I'll set it up for you. I won't take you all through it because it takes too long and we don't have active participants the way we're set up. But the exercise is, I'll do the setup with you. Think of a time in your life in the past, and you're not going to tell us what it is. So you're going to feel free and comfortable to remember it. A time in the past when you were overwhelmed, when you felt things would never get better, when you felt lost and alone. So we do that as a setup. And then the first question we ask is, when you were depressed, in crisis, and overwhelmed, what made it hard to connect with you? Well, I didn't want people to know how I was feeling. I was ashamed of what I was going through. I was too angry. I didn't think anybody could help. I was pissed off. I just wanted to hide. There's countless reasons. And our attitude is that our experience doesn't give us understanding, and the semantics are important here. Our experience doesn't give us understanding into what other people go through, but it does give us an empathetic resonance. Right? So, I lost my father, you lost yours. We can have very different experiences. The loss of my stepfather was a much more traumatic issue to me than the loss of my birth father. And I don't know if how they'll take this, but I've been a dog person my whole life. And especially running a crisis hotline for 30 years, my golden retriever was my greatest therapeutic response in the world. And when I lost Murphy, my golden retriever, I was devastated for weeks. In some ways that other losses that you would think would have been more impactful did not. you know. In Samaritan's training, there's an example of a woman who calls the hotline and says, I'm going to kill myself. And as you explore the conversations, well, what's going on? What's brought you to that point? And she goes, my goldfish died. And when we do that in training class, people tend to giggle or smile for a second. And we go, well, first of all, how do you know what that means to her? First of all, it may not even be a goldfish, or it could be something that her last living thing that her husband got her and is left there. Or she could live alone in the house and it's the last living thing she has to look at. I mean, we can come up with 100 scenarios. So we remind ourselves from our own experience, think of what you went through that nobody could understand. Think of what happened. Another question we ask is, when you were depressed and overwhelmed, how did it manifest? How did you feel physically and emotionally? And it's like, well, my head hurt, my stomach hurt, I couldn't breathe, I had panic attacks, I couldn't sleep or I couldn't stop sleeping, I couldn't eat or I couldn't stop eating, I lost interest in friends, I couldn't go to work, I was feeling what's the word I want? Fatigued all the time, or I was hyper and running through the universe. My joke is, if you come to visit me and my apartment is immaculate, it means I'm a little depressed, because I get into very compulsive. Everything needs to be neat. Everything needs to be organized. Everything, and you, oh wow, your apartment's so lovely. You say, might not be so great. And each one of us, I'm giving you my example. You have yours. Things that people don't understand, or they see the way that makes sense to them, but it doesn't give you insight per se into who they are and what they're going through. And then ultimately we say, when you were depressed and you were overwhelmed and you felt things would never get better, what did people say or do? You reached out for help. What did people say or do that shut you down, turned you off, made you regret reaching out to them? And 99.9% of the time, and I'm talking from maybe 50,000 people we've done this exercise with, it was always, I didn't like them saying they understand. It's like, they understand what happened in their life. They don't know what's going on in mine. They're going home to have dinner with their wife and watch a movie. I'm sitting here alone. Don't tell me you understand. Right? They didn't like people giving advice, telling them, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? We call it, do you want something to drink? Someone saying, oh, I'm really thirsty and I really don't know what to do. It's like, well, have you thought of having a glass of water? I mean, our responses, our advice is always so, we may not think it's superficial, but we've just come to the party. We're just getting the basic information and we're only getting what the person's told us. So people hated to be given advice. They didn't like when people turned it from a focus, and I know this is a therapeutic device. I personally am pretty opposed to it, though there are in strong therapeutic environments, obviously of value to use this tool. But I think too often it's used to turn the focus from the person you're talking to yourself. Well, when I went through this, when I was a kid, when I was in school, it's like, who the F cares what you did? That was 10, 20, 30 years ago, and you're not me. You're a Hispanic female. I'm a Chinese adolescent. You're an old white man. I'm a kid who's just got out of high school. We're not the same people. And to carry it even further, how many of us have siblings, brothers and sisters, and we react very differently to circumstances, even though we have the same genetics, the same background, the same education, the same upbringing, the same coping mechanisms that we were taught, but we react differently. Right? So our whole attitude is summarized in this statement: you never know. You never know what anybody's thinking. You never know what anybody's feeling. When you think you do, it's not about them, it's about you. And we remind ourselves of this all the time. There's a line from, I think it's Plato, never be positive, never be wrong. And that doesn't mean don't be positive like affirmative, it means don't be absolute. We always say to people working on the hotline, if you think you know what's going on, shut up, step back, and regroup. Because if your focus is on trying to figure it out, it's not on the person you're talking to, it's on you. If your focus is understanding, then your communication is about what do I need to make sense of this so I can figure out what's going on in order to respond to this person. To what end? You're going to figure it out? It's a whole different approach where we talk about, instead of focusing on facts and information and problem solving, and certainly a problem solving model, obviously in therapy and clinical work, has 100 places where it's appropriate, but not in emotional crisis response. And crisis response work is process work. The person's depressed today, they're probably going to be depressed tomorrow. They're at their session with you now. Tonight, when they go home, they're going to be by themselves. They called the hotline at 11 o'clock at night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when they wake up and their meds have kicked off. It's this ongoing thing. It's a continuum. So it's very hard for many of us to get out of a problem-solving outcome diagnostic model and get into a communication, processing, ongoing approach model. And one of the ways we kind of try to make that visual is, imagine, pick someplace you've been in your life where you saw a beautiful sunset, or you were by the ocean, something you saw that just was striking to you. It caught you and it was stimulating to you. What's the difference between standing where you are and taking it all in, or going, what snapshot am I going to take in order to send to my friends back home? And that's the difference between process and outcome focus. Each has its purpose, but from Samaritan's perspective, when we're responding to someone, we're responding to the whole person. We're not trying to fix it or solve it. It's, what are they thinking now? What are they feeling now? We're dealing with them now. Whatever problem, issues, or risk they have is happening right now. We're not dealing in the past. We're not focusing on the future. We're in this moment now. We're not a spiritualist group per se, but we're very much about being in the moment. Be here at that moment with this person now. And that's where the connection is. So these are some of the things that we look at. And we remind ourselves of the complexity of people's experience. Sambal, can we get the contributing factor slide up, please?
Yes.
And all of these visuals, they're just little snapshots of things. So, we remind ourselves that people are complex, that they're multidimensional, that there are countless causal factors to what they're going through, and it's not one. We say at Samaritans, nobody is one thing. Now, we have great respect for our friends who work with veterans and people in the LGBT community and people working with social and ethnic groups and homeless. Every one of these groups is doing great advocacy work to help the people that fit in that category. We could take down the slide, please. But the point we want to make is nobody is one thing. Nobody's gay. Nobody's homeless. Nobody's divorced. People are complex. They're dimensional. Come from a Hispanic background. There was domestic violence in the house. Ran away at a young age. Was in the military. Was exposed to violence in the military. Came back. Had a substance abuse problem. Was making a lot of money. Lost the job. Is now living on the street. If we deal with people, I think it's Wordsworth who said, when we label, we dismiss. Right. So we try to look at things on a multidimensional. Could we put up the iceberg image, please? And one of the issues that we like to point to is that frequently when we're responding to someone, we're focusing on what we can see, the tip of the iceberg. Well, 75% of an iceberg is underwater. We always say that if it was only what you could see, the Titanic never sinks and goes on to sail another day. So it's what we see that we focus on, but it's what it's sitting on that causes whether someone's in distress or otherwise. You know, one person gets a cancer diagnosis and feels they should just go home and lay in bed and wait to die. And another person starts a macrobiotic diet, goes to the gym, starts riding, and makes plans to travel. It's not what the causal factor, the catalytic factor, what we call the inciting action, it's what it's sitting on. We could take that down, please. And what people's experience, or I don't care how professional and how capable and expertise, the expertise you have as a psychotherapist, uh, you can spend 20 years with someone and not get to the heart of why they're behaving in a certain way or the different factors that are happening. So we remind ourselves again about that you never know. It's not that we're going to figure it out. It's all these different things are going on, many of which a person isn't even going to realize. Until my father said to me, "You're teaching people not to be like me." I've been doing this for 20 years. I never really quite made that connection. It's pretty obvious, but I didn't make it. And how many things are obvious that you're not making? Now in Samaritan's training, I don't leave it as a rhetorical question. We come in and we drill right into you until you confront it, because our belief is unless you actually challenge your preconceptions, your assumptions, you're not going to be able to modify your behavior. So we point to the fact that you never know, and that you don't need to know to be supportive. I don't need to understand what's going with you to listen to you, to be connected to you, to pay attention to you. One of the more important clinical behaviors that should be taught in every graduate program is that behavior. It's actually from the Latin. I don't like to get too esoteric, but in this case, I will use the term. And people, if you want, I'll spell it for you. But people should be taught to shut up. Right? You can't be listening if you're doing all the talking. And that talking can be verbal or it can be internal. Oh my God, what am I going to do? That reminds me when I was a kid. I don't really see an answer to this. I got to fill out that damn paperwork because the head of guidance is after me to hand in my records. I have to make a child abuse report. And not that that stuff doesn't have validity, but if you're caught up in that's why people who are caring and sensitive frequently don't listen very well, because they're so busy examining what they think, I'm so sensitive, I care what's going on with you. Well, we've come to learn that the idea of sensitivity is the ability to receive signals. Do we have the satellite image? So if I'm concerned about what's going on with you, if I'm thinking to myself, I need to go to the bathroom. This is the fourth time this week that someone's talked to me about being suicidal. I got all these things going on, then I can't be receiving signals. You can't be listening if you're doing all the talking. You could close that, please. So the idea that we never know, that we don't need to know, is a building block of the work we do. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get an awareness, a perception of what's going on with people. And that's how we use warning signs, risk, and protective factors. We call it creating an emotional profile, but we point out the emotional profile is only part of what's going on, but it gives us something to hold on to in terms of our connectivity, our steering, our communication. The quick review, and at the end of this, we're going to put up a link to a resource guide that we have that's going to have all the information we're talking about there in much more detail. So this is just a quick overview. But risk factors are conditions or environments or situations. So right now, we're all at risk. You may not realize if you live in New York City that New York City has higher risk than most cities in the country. Tall buildings, rivers, public transportation, all easily accessible means to hurt yourself. Right? In fact, 25% of the suicides in Manhattan are from people from out of town who come to Manhattan to take their own lives. So there's all kinds of risk. I won't go into detail because one of the things we know is the more you describe how people can hurt themselves, you're empowering. Visualization is a wonderful thing. It can help you cross a finish line. It can also help you take your own life. But every one of us has the means under our kitchen sink. Uh, every one of us has the means at our fingertips, right? So it's a matter of understanding someone's state of mind, the warning signs, the risk factors. So the risk factor might be a family predisposition towards alcoholism. A warning sign is starting to drink more. A protective factor is a caring mate who recognizes that pattern and helps anticipate it and helps slow us down. So if we look at the people we're responding to, not just in this one dimension, but as part of it, we started out looking at their thoughts and their feelings and what they're going through. But then if we look at their warning signs, risk, and protective factors help mitigate or reduce risk. If I have an outlet, I mean, that's what hotlines are about. That's what a lot of spiritual support is about. That's what CBT and DBT are about, coping mechanisms. That's what we'll talk just a real quick moment before I end about safety planning, being prepared. These all reduce and mitigate. But at the same time, if I'm a Catholic and I believe in the church, that can be a protective factor. If I can't talk to my priest about my suicidal feelings, now it becomes a risk factor. So, again, nothing is black and white. So we're kind of looking at these things in kind of this dimensional warning sign risk factor approach. Certainly, we want to remind ourselves that anybody we're dealing with, if we're getting any kind of risk, if we're getting any kind of warning signs, we don't do, I need to ask you, I puts the focus on me, need is, I really don't want to, but I'm going to do it anyway. But we're using our active listening, and it's like, Cynthia, you said you were feeling overwhelmed. You said it gotten to the point that sometimes you feel like putting your head through the wall and you wish you could just disappear. Has it gotten to the point that you're thinking about suicide? And we use the word suicide. We don't say kill yourself, take your own life. Back to the stigma. There's no reason we can't ask. Just because you're asking somebody what they're thinking doesn't mean it's going to enhance risk. In fact, it's very much of a rapport building tool. I was afraid to even mention that to anyone. And here you are bringing it up in a calm, relaxed, non-dramatic manner, because anybody can feel that way. So we develop risk models to determine risk. And you're going to get this resource guide. You're going to see a whole bunch of different risk models that you can access. And you should have one at your fingertips. But basically, there's some version of exposure to means and visualization. The more I can plan it, the more I think about it, the more the materials are accessible, and the immediacy of those, the higher the risk. So we make sure that we're developing an emotional profile of the people we're responding to, and that we're determining a risk. We'll call it assessing suicide ideation. Now, all of this is great, but if we're not communicating effectively with people, we're not going to be able to do any of this. So Sumerians is adamant, and we spend most of our time training, focusing on being effective communicators. And that being an effective communicator takes place from the back seat, not from the front. The focus is on the person you're talking to, not on yourself. So we say, don't use first person. No, I, me, my, we, us. And you go, well, I just want the person to know I care. So yes, that's it. You want the person to know. So whether you think it's caring or not, your focus is on yourself. And if you use the first person, no matter what follows it, the focus is on you. So we don't use first person. We're very, very careful in how we use close-ended statements. I can tell you, spending a lifetime in communication, it amazes me how many people think using close-ended statements establish rapport. Do you do this often? Did you think of doing this? Have you tried that? And you'll find if you're doing using close-ended statements, you're doing all the talking. And it's like, Why do you have so much to say? You're going to talk somebody out of their feelings? Most of what we should be doing is receiving, not sending. So using our active listening is so important. And at the heart of that is this key awareness tied to communication. People say what they think, what they think they think, what they're trying on for size, what they want us to think, or what just caught their attention. We hear what we want to hear, what we're prepared to hear, what fits our framework, what is the focus of our attention right now, or just something that was said that we caught in passing. There is no truth. There is no absolute. You can't define it and decide what it's made of. It's amorphous. We don't try to fix it, solve it, or define it. The power of listening is the fact that it reduces risk. There's hotline studies that show when responses are active, direct, client-focused, and focus on thoughts and feelings, it provides a form of pressure release. It actually reduces blood pressure, actually reduces risk and severity of warning signs factors. I made a comment about my beloved golden retriever. After 9/11, those of us that worked at the Family Respite Center at Javits Center, where thousands upon thousands of people were coming. And one of the things very early, the counselors at DOH and from some of the psychoanalytic groups began to learn is people were there, but they wouldn't talk. And they brought in 20 or more golden retrievers and just started walking around this giant auditorium, and people would come up and pet the dog, feel relaxed, feel calm, not feel pressured, and open up. So these are lessons. And again, I know I'm oversimplifying this. Each one of these obviously has much more depth to it, but they're things to remind us. So, you know, if you went back to the active listening, there's a phrase called cognitive empathy, which is basically how we can perceive and understand another person without making it a reflection of ourselves. Now, that's a real easy thing to say and a very hard thing to train yourself to do, especially if you're trained in diagnostic behaviors and problem-solving approaches, and that's how your mind is programmed. And the other term, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is a term called cognitive dissonance, which is how we try to make what we're perceiving fit into our framework so we're comfortable with it, which makes every encounter about us and not about the person. And we know in suicide, there's a lot of suicide hotlines that their focus is assessing risk. It's like assessing risk is a tool. The goal of a hotline should be as a protective factor to help reduce isolation, provide the person an outlet. And the most important aspect is not intellectual or communication-wise, it's the law of physics. One of the leading risk factors for depression and suicide is isolation. And if you're connected to someone, you're less isolated. People who swim together don't tend to drown. So we're constantly reminding ourselves of these kinds of issues and approach. So these are things that we think of, and at the same time, we remind ourselves that you never know what's coming your way, to expect the unexpected and be prepared for that which you're not prepared for. And that's a simple introduction to the concept of safety planning. And I'm sure most of you are aware, safety planning was first developed actually by a woman named Barbara Stanley for the US Air Force, because the Air Force was one of the first military groups to recognize that they were losing more members of the forces to suicide than they were to warfare. By the way, that's true around the world. The World Health Organization tells us more people around the world die from suicide than die from warfare, and think of the genocide that we're aware of, and still there's more suicide. So this is, again, an international, a global issue. So we remind ourselves to be as effective as we can in first day of hotline training, we have people write in big letters, "It's not about me." Uh, and we're constantly reminding ourselves of these mantras, so to speak, but we also recognize we need to be prepared for that which we're not prepared for. The advice we give to caregivers and health providers and family members and friends is to put together if I'm going to just use the computer as an easy way to do it, you could do it with paper, you could do it with anything, is put a file, a folder on your computer, a safety preparedness folder. And what are the things, come up with your worst case scenarios. What are you afraid is going to walk in the door? What are you afraid the student's going to say? What situation do you think you're going to be faced with that you don't think you'll be prepared for? And play it out. So, well, all I have is a logic model. All I have is a assessment tool that's a logic model. Do you have thoughts? Do you have plans? Do you have means? Have you set a time? Well, a version of that for the hotline, which is anonymous and confidential, might be okay. But in face-to-face counseling, you need a more sophisticated assessment model. So, and we're going to give you this resource guide, and it's going to have all this stuff there. So we're suggesting when you get the resource guide, you scan through it and find these things and put them in the folder. So, there's the Columbia Severity Screening Tool, or there's the DOH, was it PH 3, or, the basic screening tool they use for the department. Have one that works for you. If you're not up to date on your warning signs and risk factors, have that right in front of your face. Safety planning is not only a tool for an organization, it's a tool to use as a counseling tool. And so when you go to our resource guide, you're going to see the safety planning tool. And then if you go to webinars, you're going to see a webinar that teaches you how to use it. So prepare yourself, have that stuff in front of you. We have fire drills. How many of us know someone who's died in a fire? And I don't mean to minimize that. Someone may. But statistically, we have fire drills, not because someone may die in a fire, but it teaches us as a group and an organization to coordinate, to collaborate, to follow directions. A lot of people believe that our response to 9/11 was so effective and organized because we all spent our lifetime doing fire drills. Shut up, follow, go down here, do this, these kinds of things. It hasn't, what has it been, 25 years where it was suggested that every school and health provider learn CPR. Well, not too many of us have watched people choke to death, but again, and also preparation creates confidence and confidence creates calm, and calm creates effective communication. So we suggest that you put together your own little safety plan toolkit. You can do it in a folder, you can do it on your computer, put it on your phone, and also have appropriate referrals and resources so they're at your fingertips. You're dealing with a domestic violence situation, the woman can't go home, she's got a 2-year-old kid. What are you going to do? Well, there's 3 organizations that will take that child for the night. I've been doing this for 30 years. I have a wonderful history. It's a problem tied to sexual identity. Well, we have a plethora of wonderful organizations that provide support to different aspects of the community. Whatever the culture, whatever the problem, have culturally appropriate referrals. And referrals are only effective if the person who is getting it is interested in it and takes part in it. One of the things I've observed in 30 years in the field, people love to give referrals. But the fact is, research suggests as few as 20% are ever used. And it tends to be people giving referrals because the person giving it wants to feel safe, wants to feel secure, and feel, oh, I've done something. Well, being present, listening, focusing on someone's thoughts and feelings, providing them a safe outlet, being available, not only is providing a protective factor for that person, it's helping provide a decrease in the intensity of what they're experiencing. It reduces their isolation, and and this is why Samaritans was designed, people who have a good experience with that are much more apt to seek other forms of help. So it's not just us. We're part of this continuum. And how we behave and how we respond is setting the tone and attitude for this person's way of coping potentially for the rest of their life. So that's the short version of the Samaritans approach. Following, I know, I think Bob and maybe Gail are going to make some closing comments. Following that, we're going to put up a slide, and the slide's going to have a PDF that you can access this resource guide. And you're welcome to share this stuff with everybody in any fashion. And you're also going to get links to 2 podcasts that go more in depth into the active listening communication tools, as well as assessing risk and suicide ideation.